Thank you for coming once more to an eTwinning online seminar. It's great to see some familiar names here in the chat. We are here today to talk about spaces for learning space. I'm sure we will have a very interesting seminar. Today's seminar, as I was saying, we will talk about using spaces for classroom activities. We will talk about practical ideas of using spaces for learning activities. And also we will discuss a little bit about the real and virtual spaces for learning. And to talk about this, I invited Conor Galvin. Conor Galvin is a PhD and a lecturer and researcher at UCD School of Education in Dublin, Ireland, where he contributes to various education development studies, ICT, and research methods programs. His teaching interests include active learning at university and school level and education technology. He has been a passionate advocate of eTwinning since its very early days, and he was a member of the original eTwinning Pedagogical Advisory Group. It's a long time ago. Dr. 10 years ago at least. Dr. Galvin holds the President's Award for Teaching Excellence at UCD Dublin as well. And he is the President of the Education Studies Association of Ireland and Chair of the Research Group at the Island of Ireland Standing Conference for Teacher Education North and South. So with no further ado, I will give the floor to Conor. Welcome, Conor, and thank you for accepting this invitation to be with us today.
Thank you very much indeed, Rutha. So I've not used this platform for some time, but I'm sure we'll figure it out as we go along. So again, thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak to eTwinners, and I'm not just saying that, I genuinely mean it. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk tonight about this notion of learning spaces and spaces for learning. This is something that has interested me for some time. I have more questions than answers, so the tone of the presentation will be to actually put out some issues for discussion and conversation, and then every so often, if the technology allows it, we'll stop and have a little, a short conversation about what we've covered so far. Now I'm looking for the slide backwards, so I'll just try the first one here. Let me see. Yeah, I think we're good on that. Health warning. You always start a talk like this with a health warning. I am a researcher. I do a lot of research in relation to information technology. I do a lot of research in relation to teaching and learning. I'm not convinced that we do either terribly well when it comes to working with young teachers, but I'm always hopeful. And I spend a lot of time in these spaces trying to make sense of what's going on, what I see around me, and offering advice and guidance such as I can to colleagues. So that's the health part. I will come across a little bit as a theorist. I'm sorry about that, but I do try to add practical aspects to the work as I go along also. So without further ado, as Ruth said, here we go. I'm starting with a picture because I use a lot of images. I think images are very good for getting people to think a little bit. What I'm putting forward here is a stage. Learning spaces come in a different number of ways, different sizes, different shapes. I've always been attracted by theatre myself. Maybe that's why I became a teacher, I don't know. But the idea that you can actually learn as much by being in the audience as actually participating is one that intrigues me quite a lot. So, we have always assumed you learn by watching. I don't think that's totally true. I think you learn by watching sometimes, but more often you learn by doing, by being that actor, by being on that stage, by being up there, actually doing the painting, making the scenery, building the story, doing all of that rather than just sitting back and letting it happen for you. So why is this important? Well, in my view, we spend too much time, even as teachers, we spend too much time letting stuff happen to us. We don't do enough as a profession to take the initiative and to push forward in relation to areas that we can develop and that we know quite a lot about. Now, an example of that is something across my radar a number of years ago originally, and it's still there, and it's something that I'd be curious to see whether a lot of teachers have actually come across. It's this group known as the European Digital Forum. Now, what is this and why is it of kind of interest and importance to us here today? Well, if you were to say that the digital is profoundly important, and if you were to put a group of people together and ask them to write a very profoundly influential piece, 99 people were invited to write a document for this particular group recently. Now, my question sort of to you would be a very informal question. It's not a trick or anything else, but how many of those would you expect actually come from a teaching background? How many teachers would you invite to contribute to a forum like this, where we're talking about the digital future, where we're talking about how to work with kids, how children learn, and so on? The answer to my mind is quite shocking. Someone says there one or two. Okay, but the answer to my mind is quite shocking. There is not a single teacher in that group. 99 voices, no teachers, no educators. They come from business, they come from technology, they come from all over the place, and there are 15 or 16 mentions in this particular text, it's only about 70 pages long, of what teachers should do and how they should do it. Now, that bothers me a little bit. So partly what I'm trying to do today is take back that space and make suggestions about how we as teachers can be a little bit more proactive about putting out this idea of, what our learning and teaching spaces can be and how we can actually use those. It is important because it connects to this, again, another initiative, the Digital Agenda Initiative, as it's actually called, which is supporting, among other things, the eTwinning platform and the funding that actually is made available to help teachers in and through eTwinning and many other initiatives, such as those funded under Erasmus+. All of these have one thing in common in the sense that they push forward this notion of the digital citizenship. And I personally welcome the focus over the last couple of months on this particular area, and I know that Ruth's seminar series addresses this very specifically. So I'd like to put down one or two markers from my own experience and from my own thoughts about this notion of digital citizenship, and particularly the curriculum that can and should perhaps support that. Now, a negative start perhaps, but very often when we talk about digital citizenship, we talk about, is it all about getting kids to be civil, getting them to behave themselves and not do stupid things when they're online? Is it about identity awareness? Is it about identity online? Is it about protection and so on? Is it about keeping kids safe? And yes, it is. It's all of those and no, because there are other things as well involved. Now, some of the earlier seminars in this series and some of the follow-up ones will deal with those areas of staying safe online and so on. So I'm not going to overdwell on that particular idea, but I do want to make one or two observations around it. The first one, and this comes from the work of Sonia Livingston going back over several years, who's a well-known commentator in this area. She says the biggest challenge for teachers is that we need to teach them to take care of themselves. It's not all about banning and scanning and so on, that the best thing we can do as teachers is help kids to take care of themselves, to learn to be their own filters. And I would agree with this, but it's a huge challenge. And some of what I'll talk about in terms of working in digital spaces will actually address that. There's lots of initiatives at the country level. This is one from a couple of years back, the EU Kids Online from Slovenia. Super initiative. If you don't know it, it's worth having a look at. But there are other similar ones, I suppose, right throughout the arrangements. Right across all of the countries that are involved in eTwinning. We've had WebWise and so on, and we have European level and also local level work in this space. But I would argue we need to go much, much further than just, keeping them safe online. I think we need to think in terms of helping kids to become fully engaged digital citizenships. So Michael Vesch is a great commentator in this space, and if you don't know his work, I can't recommend it to you highly enough. That's Wesch. A lot of his stuff is available online in YouTube videos. He's also written a number of very, very interesting books in this space, but he makes a really good point about citizenship when he says this, and I'll let you read it for yourselves. In a sense, the lives are entwined. You can't separate the digital from the non-digital any longer. If we want kids to be citizens, they have to be rounded citizens, citizens that are digitally capable as well as citizens that are capable in the real world more generally. Okay, so this is again Michael Vish. That's one of his better videos. If you look it up on YouTube, it's called simply Digital Citizenship, Michael Vish and Digital Citizenship, and he talks for about 15-20 minutes. I think it's well worth a look at some particular point. Okay, now to save you the trouble in one sense, but I do recommend you have a look at it later, he makes three particular points when it comes to learning to be a citizen. He says we have to help kids to become critical, we have to help them to become creative, and we have to help them to become participatory. In other words, to cooperate with each other, to work together, to share space, to share activities, to share tasks, and to learn by doing in that sense. Okay? Similar comments have come from Howard Gardner. Now, some of you who will be familiar with multiple intelligence and all those ideas will recognize Howard Gardner straight away. His Project Zero covers much the same ground, and it talks an awful lot about, you know, digital citizenship, citizenship in the real world, but he makes one interesting addition, if you like, to the list. He says it has to be about ethical thinking as well, that it has to be about what is right, what is fair, what is good, what is not. And I think when you put those together, you get this challenge, and it goes way beyond the digital. We're not just talking digital here, we're talking much more wide. We're talking about fundamental skills of thinking, writing, communication, teamwork, ideas like that, and the ability of people to survive in this new working environment and to collaborate from a wide range of backgrounds. Now that's Helen Chan from Stanford speaking there, not actually me. And I agree with it up to a point, because I think that's profoundly important, but I think that there's an educative aspect as well. And I think that's one of the things that well-conceived digital spaces and well-conceived real-world spaces for learning can actually help with. So, can schools do all of this? That's my first pause point, if you like. Can schools, is it reasonable to expect schools to do all of this work in relation to all of these areas? And maybe I'll just stop there for a second and have a quick look through what's coming through on the comments and so on so far. So given this wide vision of digital citizenship, is it reasonable to ask schools to do it? And can schools do all of those things? So first comment in, no way. Okay.
Sorry, Conor.
Yes.
I carry problems down here down south. We're not as up to date as the dubs up there in UCD. Good evening, all. Just a short thing. I'm a quicker speaker than I am a typist. I must brush up on my typing skills before I join the next webinar. I believe yes we should do all of this. I believe yes we can do all of this, but I think we need the toolbox to do it, and that is the can of worms, I suppose, in the Irish system that we would open. Teachers are coming out from pre-service, they're going through service. I suppose maybe they're not getting the correct toolkit in pre-service. We're certainly not getting the opportunity to upskill during service, and maybe there's a lack of willingness maybe as well during service to upskill. And then the final pieces of jigsaw, of course, all of this requires resourcing in the form of materials and funding. But to answer your question, Conor, I think yes, in the words of Obama himself, yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
And I believe, and as an educator and who's passionate about technology and education, I believe yes, we should as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Donald. That's very useful. I've been watching the comments coming in. There's a very interesting comment there from Anita, for example, about being involved in Reggio Emilia as a methodology in terms of teaching and learning. I find that very interesting because that is an active methodology. That is a system that encourages children to learn through doing, through being, through play, and so on. And I think a lot of what I would sign up for would be very much in that lines. Donald, I do appreciate your comment. I think it's interesting in the sense that, you know, you made a couple of very useful observations there. You talked about pre-service and you talked about in-career development and how difficult it is to actually come out with the right package. And I would agree, because, you know, what is the right package? What should we do that can actually help young student teachers, particularly, to prepare for their futures. I don't think there's a perfect answer to it, but I think some of what I'm going to say in the rest of this session might help and might suggest one or two ways forward. Okay, so the picture I'm giving you now is kind of, there's a guy in the UK called Bill Brockman, and he's one of these people who's what's called a one-man band. This is very much the image that teachers are expected to live up to. We are expected to be able to do everything. We're expected to be able to teach, to mark, to grade, to be psychologists, to look after, wounded feelings, to nurture a million and one jobs, all of which require, our unique skill sets as a teacher. Then you have the technology, and that's the dark glasses in the second part of the picture. You have the belief, almost the kind of zealot type belief that technology can solve so much. I go a certain distance. I don't think it solves everything. I think it's useful, but I think it has its limitations. And that's an example of people trying out a VR headset there. I tried it out as well on the day, and it was interesting, but not brilliant. Then there are the spaces, and that's where I'm going to turn at this stage. I'd like to kind of move on to the main part, if you like, of my talk, where I talk about spaces. Now, the journey motive is one that I'm going to use, and the notion of postcards is one that I'm going to use, because there's far, far too much to actually cover in a talk like this. So I'm not going to try. I'm just going to kind of drop a couple of ideas in, maybe about 6, 7 ideas in all, if that makes sense. Each of them beginning with a postcard, a little image, a couple of lines, and then something we can actually think a little bit about. So here's my first one. This is the university where I work. It's absolutely beautiful. I've no idea where they got the sunshine. It's not a typical feature of my day-to-day existence, but it is a beautiful place. And universities are interesting and in the main very privileged places to work. On the other hand, this is pretty much the typical experience of students, stacked high, spaces that are almost, last century before in terms of their utility. Yes, we have more technology, but the technology is used in most cases in rather, I would say, interesting ways. Some teachers at university level do fantastic work, particularly when it comes to working with young teachers in preparation for work in school systems. Others not so. Others are a little bit more old school, perhaps. So yes, we have all of these beautiful facilities. Yes, we have state-of-the-art technology. Yes, we have all of that. And we are a little bit behind on the curve in many ways, because we don't have, for example, the kind of things that they would have in the University of Leeds or Queensland, where you have these vast open learning commons areas that are quite interesting. Now, I've started to see those, or versions of those, turning up in school. They're much smaller, but they're interesting because they're full of technology, they've got a bit of light, they've got a bit of space, and they've got nice chairs. And maybe that's as far as the thinking goes in a lot of regards. Hong Kong has led the world in relation to all of this type of work. They have been for years in City Hong Kong University doing this kind of space building. Other places like the JFC Junior Forum, okay, in Harvard, that's actually a cafeteria, which is multi-purpose and serves as a large-scale meeting room in the evening time. So all of those walls and everything that you see in the walkways are the other floors. They've simply taken all the cafeteria material out and turned it into a meeting room. Okay, this is an interesting one. It's from a place called the Teaching Grid in the University of Warwick. Now, when I show this to colleagues, and I do a little bit of work with colleagues where I'm trying to persuade them to teach a little bit more adventurously, the very first comment I very often get is, yeah, well, what did they do with the other 200? Because in universities, it is a numbers game. There are lots of people, and this is an example of a high level of resource being put into working with a small number of students. It does work, but it's resource intensive. The space itself is custom built. Now, what intrigued me most about it was that the money and the push and the thinking for this came from the library staff. It was the librarians who pushed for this, not the people in the School of Education, not the people in the Teaching and Learning Centre. It was the librarians. And that says a lot to me about those spaces where learning has traditionally happened and the ones that are changing most suddenly and most fully. Here's another picture from, again, this one is also from the University of Warwick. I love this picture for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's impossible to see where the front of the room is. It's a teaching space, but where is the front? And the answer is the front is everywhere. Lots of space in the walls to do activity work, lots and lots of room to move around. You can even have wheelchairs and so on move in with very, very little difficulty. It's not a traditional teaching situation, but it's quite interesting as a learning space. It opens up all sorts of possibilities that are not available in more traditional situations. And yes, it is. I've seen a comment there. It is definitely a very, very nice space. In universities, we extensively make use of virtual spaces as well. This, for example, is an online meeting, not terribly dissimilar from the one we're currently in, where a group of 22 universities globally meet up once a week to talk about development issues, and their students are exposed to thinking from the highest of levels. We get speakers in from the United Nations and so on, and it's a wonderful experience for all of us. But we're very privileged to be able to do that kind of thing in the main. And I would be much happier if that was also available to schools. It's not so much. Universities struggle with this idea of MOOCs. We don't have it sorted. We haven't got our heads around it. And I'm very, very pleased to see the way the teachers are using MOOCs. And one example of that would be the MOOC that runs from time to time out of the EUN, where some very intriguing work is done on a week-to-week basis in this space, and it makes activities, it makes materials, it makes ideas available that would not be available in what Donald rightly calls the more traditional type of CPD setting, continual professional development setting, or even in initial teacher education. So plugging into those, I think, is an important part of where we need to be going. Now, so I suppose to summarize this part of my kind of talk would be to say that universities and higher education has it very good in terms of spaces. Do we have good spaces? The answer is in the main yes. And yes, we are getting better at using those spaces. Much of the work that I do increasingly over the last couple of years is more activity based. We have smaller contact groups. Assessment is changing, and that is something that I think is profoundly important. Assessment has to change if we're going to make any inroads at all in terms of using technologies. But at universities, we still have a very, very long way to go in terms of getting the very best from learning spaces, augmented by, supplemented by, or complemented by technologies. But the spaces, in my view, are what are actually important. So the second question I'd like to kind of throw out there, Rutha, if I may, please, is do universities, and again, my experience is limited to only 3 countries. I've worked in Wales, I've worked in England, and I've worked in Ireland. I've visited others, but I've never had the opportunity to teach in them to the extent that I would like to. So my second question to you as a group of colleagues is, do universities in your countries, do they do enough to help teachers think about teaching and learning in your view, particularly given the changing nature of technology? So that's my kind of second pause point. If you want to spend a little bit of time thinking about that, please. And maybe give me 1 or 2 comments in the observations, or maybe Ruth, we might pick up. So there's some coming in very quickly. I don't think so. No, absolutely not. Cyprus barely trying to do. No university contact at all. So the picture coming through, at least in the chat line, is quite negative. I find that interesting, because my own argument would be that we probably do have a space, but that we don't do anything like enough to help in relation to teachers in the field particularly. But then other people might think that universities have no place in that. I don't know. Okay. So moving on then to the next kind of section, if you like, of the talk, I'd like to now move to look at a couple of interesting uses of spaces for learning that are outside of the ordinary. They don't connect with universities. They don't connect directly with schools, but they have connections to schools, as you'll see, in terms of the kids and the students that are actually using them particularly. So there are about 3 of them in all. I'll start with the first one. And here's my first postcard from the edge, as they say. This is a group of young people that attend a particular program called the Bridge 21 program. Now, Bridge 21 is an access program that's run by Trinity College Dublin, small university, some of you might have heard of it, centre of Dublin. It's 500 or 600 years old, and it does super work, to be perfectly honest. Now, one of the things they've been doing in the past couple of years is opening up possible entry points for what they call non-conventional students. And one of those is what you might call this bridge project. Now, the bridge project has a number of characteristics that I think are really interesting. It is a physical space. It is a series of connected rooms in a building about 2 streets away from the university itself. Okay, so it's a little bit unusual in that sense, but it has a number of kind of characteristics that I find really intriguing. This is a typical bridge session. Young people, 16, 17 years of age, still not decided about college and so on. When you look at it, a number of things strike you immediately. This image is from the bridge itself. The rooms are painted wildly. The kids did this themselves. They painted the rooms up. They made some like cityscapes. They made some like jungles. And it was, it was done, I won't say on the cheap. It was done relatively lightly in terms of expense. The technology is not new. The technology is all repurposed. It's reused. It's borrowed from other parts of the university. Some of it is secondhand and so on. But the point is the technology is not important. The space is what's important. 4 heads working together on a particular idea, a particular project, trying to come up with a solution in 20-25 minutes to a challenge that's been set for them. They have access to, and the guy looking over their shoulders there, they have access to advice and guidance, but it's only made available if they ask for it. Otherwise, they instruct each other. They work together to come up with the solutions. And this is an intriguing use. You can see it's like cubicles. They work in teams of 5 and 6. And yes, I see Donald is mentioned there. It's very, very well known and very well admired. And there are other versions of it springing up at this stage, which I'm delighted to say. They've also started to move into more conventional schooling practices using what's called the Bridge 21 project. Anyway, to go on, the next one I'm going to point to is again a little bit different. This is another out-of-school project. It's called Fighting Words, and it was set up originally by an author, not a teacher, an author, a guy called Roddy Doyle. Some of you will have, I'm sure, heard of his work. He wrote the text that became the Commitments movie and a number of things like that. He's very well known in Ireland and known in other places as well. So Roddy decided that young people don't have enough opportunity to write. Got together with and this is intriguing, he got together with a human rights activist called Sean Love, and together they set up a space in a relatively run-down part of the city. Now, people will challenge me a little bit on this. It's not, it's not a really poor place in that sense, but it is starved of resources and facilities. The only thing it has locally is a very, very large football stadium. So they set this up. They called it Fighting Words. They got a number of grants and so on from arts bodies and from individual writers, but much, much more importantly, they got their time. They got volunteers, they got parents, they got writers, they got students to come in to run workshops in creative writing. And those workshops span the age range, everything from primary school right the way through to people who are young adult participants in university programs. A Fighting Words course has to be experienced to be fully believed. They're heavily oversubscribed, but they have one particular focal point. If it becomes an option between Group A and Group B, they will always go for the one that is more disadvantaged in terms of the school, the location of the school, and so on. And the work that they do, the volunteers, the writers, the teachers that are actually involved, is, in my view, quite phenomenal. It can be as staid as that. They sit back and they work on, examination type projects, or it can be as active as this, where they're co-writing basically something to do with a journal article based on the New Yorker. The young men and young women to the left and right are drawing up the illustrations, and the rest of the group are coming up with a storyline, facilitated by the technology. And that's the important part. The space is all around them. The technology augments and facilitates it. So my next kind of question would be, I suppose the observation would be that these are all out-of-school projects. These are projects that are run by people in their own time and for their own interest. Now, what strengths and drawbacks does this type of learning actually offer? And again, I'd be interested to see what comes through for a minute or two, please, on the chat screen on that one. what would you see as the strengths, and what would you see as the kind of problems, if any, associated with these types of activities? So far, interesting and wonderful. Beautiful spaces, colours, environments at Fighting Words. Very true, Donal. Yes, and again, it's not just teenagers. It goes right the way through. Young adults are also accommodated and catered for. Great involvement, yes. There's not one in Bulgaria. I see a comment there. There's not a possibility in Bulgaria. Fighting Words is actually spreading. There is now one in Belfast also, and they have negotiations ongoing with a number of European venues. So they're open to collaboration. They're open to work with other locations and other places. Management of problems. Yes, it's an interesting one. Thank you for that comment, Natalia. There are some issues, but it's amazing how kids that can cause you all sorts of problems in school settings are completely different when you take them out of those settings and work with them in something like Fighting Words environment. It's almost like a liberation in many ways. They step away from being the troublesome, cheeky kids that they very often are and become genuinely engaged. Now, does it last? I don't know, because these are not quite one-off. They're run in a series. You participate in 2-3 workshops. Does it go beyond that? Yes, they publish. These kids actually write stuff as part of their workshops, and they publish in book form and also in web form. If you look at fightingwords.ie, you'll find their website, and you'll see the work that they do. So some very interesting comments coming in there. Teachers can collaborate too. Yes, thank you. But they don't generally. What generally tends to happen is there are some teachers who are volunteers and who are there as part of the working team on the day. The teachers that arrive with the children from school, very often, they're not deliberately sidelined, but they step back because they're not trained to work in this space. Some of them come back as volunteers to join us, but in the main, they step aside, and the work is done by the learning teams, the teaching teams in Fighting Words. So that's a very interesting comment indeed. It's inclusive and engaging. Yes, there are some issues. The biggest single problem, and that's a very interesting comment there. Thank you, Antonella. It's the biggest single problem is giving enough access to enough people, because you can only run 3 sessions in the day: one in the morning, one over the lunch, one in the afternoon, sometimes into the evening, and sometimes into the holidays. But the biggest single problem that Fighting Words face is not actually management of kids. It's actually making enough time and space for all of those who wish to participate to become involved. Now, the next one, I thought long and hard about this. When Rotha asked me to look at this area, I said I'll do something on virtual as well as on real world. And then I kind of said, yes and no. And I'll tell you why. Because this looks like a standard lecture, but it's not. When you look at it very carefully, you'll see that they are all young children. They're all 12, 13, 14 in a lecture hall. And they're working on tables, on laptops, on their laps, on the floor. This is actually a coder dojo, where these children are learning to actually code. So they've repurposed the room. They've taken it over. The only interest they have in the room is the fact that it has fabulous Wi-Fi. That's what has them there. So they're all coding away in an out-of-school club. And there are lots of other examples of similar clubs increasingly across Europe. This is another, and this, to my mind, is all the good and all the bad of Coder Dojo in one particular image. It's wonderful for children to get the opportunity to do all of this coding. They work on simple programs like Scratch and so on to get started. And it's the dads and the teachers and, you know, the executives in the office where they borrow the space that actually do the teaching. But there's one particular striking feature about a picture like this that to my mind sums up an awful lot of the issues around Coder Dojo. Would anyone like to take a guess what it is? Nothing coming in so far. Some people have seen them. They've tried them with children as young as 9-year-old, and they do work. What strikes me is that it is very difficult sometimes, not always, because there are some Coder girls clubs, but it is very difficult for young girls and young women particularly to find space in clubs like this unless they really work the elbows, unless they have people there who are championing them, they have people there who insist on giving girls the opportunity to work in that space as well. And I think that that's something that organizations like Coder Dojo are working very hard to address. But it is something we need to be mindful of when we look at these crossover spaces. Once you get into the virtual world, and this is a wonderful example of a joint build. I think it's about 500 people were involved in building this. It's a Minecraft product. It was built by, as I say, a group of up to 500 people over a period of about a month and a half, and it's a model of the White City from one of the Lord of the Rings. Other virtual role-playing games, and spaces like that are also important. Then you have things like Star Citizen and other multimedia, massive online games where you can actually build stuff as well as thrash stuff. All of that is quite interesting, and it has huge possibilities in terms of digital spaces, to the point that I'm actually going to say, I'm not going to say much more about it. I think that really needs a seminar in and of itself. I'm intrigued by what I find going on in those virtual spaces. I'm troubled by a little of it, but I think it's a fantastic opportunity for young people to become involved in. Whether teachers will rise to the challenge or not is one of the real intriguing questions for me. Okay, so at this stage, I'd like to move to, I suppose, what will be, in many ways, the kind of the back part of my talk. I want to introduce the idea of what we call here the youth media team in Ireland. And I'd like to introduce it as the idea that this team is not just a group of people, it is actually a learning space. Now, again, disclosure, I've been involved quite heavily in the youth media team from its very outset. We have a website, ymt.fm. The team started about three and a half years ago at a conference. It's a fascinating story in and of itself, but I'm not going to go into too much depth and detail. Let's just say that they were all young, they were all early teenage, and they were all technologically terrified. And that's what brought them together. Now, we took the idea, to be honest, we took it from eTwinning, because I remember a number of years ago when one of the eTwinning workshops for young people, one of the winning groups from one of the original competitions, went to Lanzarote. And there were a group of kids taken out of the main block, actually used as a digital factory, where they produced a website and did pictures and so on to support the learning camp. That stayed with me. So when the opportunity arose 2 or 3 years ago to actually put a team like this together, I thought that was fantastic. Let's go for it. And it has been a very, very positive story. They come from about 5 different schools. It's a mixture of boys and girls. It varies over time and space, but they've developed their own kind of hallmarks. They've developed their own sort of way of working. One of their trademarks is this white tent, the artificial grass, the colors, the t-shirts. This is all part of what they bring with them when they travel to conferences. And they've now covered about 20 conferences up and down the country. So that's quite incredible. They've also worked with our national radio and television channel. The bottom part of the picture there shows some of the group from about 2 years ago working with their own devices, using their own phones, and I see some of the comments there in the chat at the moment about BYOD. BYOD very often is bring your own device or bring your own technology are the two terms that very often pop up. This team brings its own technology. They use neutral technology. Some of them use iPads, some of them use Android phones, some of them use Microsoft phones. As long as it can do 2 things, it's powerful and it's useful enough. Can it record voice? Because the main program that we use for that is Audio Boom. It's free to air and it's a brilliant application, very simple for kids to use, and it runs on any smartphone. So Audio Boom combined with WordPress are the 2 core technologies that we actually use. We use a number of background technologies in terms of video capture and video rendering, most of them based on Mac activities, but that's just extra. It's not the main activity. The main activity, to just go back one picture there, if I can, involves interviewing. So they interview, and that's one of Ireland's kind of leading journalists there. It was wonderful to see them turning, that's Fintan O'Toole. It was wonderful to see the kids turning the tables on one of Ireland's best investigative journalists, and actually getting him put on the spot about education and education issues. It was a terrific experience for all of us concerned, and it turned out to be a wonderful interview. So they do their interviews, they blog about it, a short blog post, they take photographs, they take short video snaps, and they put those up online. That's the basis of the work that they actually do. It's a space because it travels with them. They bring their technologies, a couple of laptops, as I say, and the technology that they have in their back pocket, and there's always people around who will actually help. Those of you from the UK will recognise Joe Dale, perhaps, in the top picture there. And on the other side is Bernie Goldbach, one of the kind of original founders of this group, along with Pam O'Brien, who both work in Limerick Institute of Technology, where the group actually started out. So that's what they do. They are so well regarded that ministers will allow them to interview them. This is our current, well, she's now acting, but she's the current Minister for Education. She's been interviewed here at a recent conference by two of the team. The guy in the background with the yellow tie, looking very, very worried, is her minder. He was terrified that she was going to be put on the spot. Now, in fairness, they did ask very good questions, but they didn't ask anything inappropriate or mischievous. And I think that's the hallmark of kids that are really thinking their way into the sorts of activities that they're actually doing. We have exported. This is the youth media team in Brussels. It's not the same kids. It's a group of young people from the Moule School who covered the Media and Learning Conference in 2013, 2014, 2015. And again, they took the same approach, very, very simple technology, and the whole thing is about building a space where they can actually ask interesting questions and learn by doing. Most of what they learned from each other on the day. We have imitators here in Ireland also. This is one called Radio TY, which is a local school in the village where I live. They were very impressed by the media group and they set up their own one and went on to win a major national prize. So Radio TY in 2015 became one of the Spider winners in the national competitions here. So we're very, very pleased about that. And they're also interviewing a minister there in that particular picture. Okay, so we're now kind of coming to I suppose the main point I want to make in terms of these spaces. If you were to take something like the idea behind the youth media team, and if you were to combine it with that interesting challenge that's been put forward by Donal and others, indeed, there are several comments in the chat line about continual professional development and the opportunities to do this type of work. What would happen if you put the two of those together? Now, it's not a trick question. It actually happened. We did that. So we brought the youth media team to my university and we introduced them to a group of teachers who were doing a course on teaching using technology, teaching not using technology. So they were basically doing a CPD type course, a continual professional development course with an emphasis on using things, using learning experiences innovatively. This is the room that we started out with. I think most of you will feel your heart sinking. It's probably the kind of room that you would recognize straight away. We go for these meetings, we have the PowerPoint, we have the bit of sound, we have the funny video, and we all go home and I won't say forget everything, but we forget quite a lot. So this is the typical sort of scenario that we were faced with this particular group of teachers. Now, there were about 25 in the group. It was a small enough group. Yeah, death by PowerPoint indeed. But this is the typical experience that they came in expecting. Now, what they didn't know is that I brought in the youth media team the same morning that they arrived for one of their full sessions. And I said to the YMT group, what would you like to do with that room? They looked at each other, they talked for a few minutes and they said, get rid of most of it. So the first thing they did was they cleared out the furniture. They literally cleared out most of the tables, most of the chairs. They brought in their own hallmark tent, their working spaces. They have some garden furniture. They went and they raided the rest of the building. They took everything they could find in the way of comfortable chairs. It had a few issues around health and safety, but we got away with it. So that's three of the team. There were about 7 of them there on the day, and they're setting up. The next thing they did was they ran the session. They actually did the instruction. So they set up their learning space and then they worked with the teachers who had actually joined them for the morning. They broke them down into groups, they gave them things to do, and they said, you have 20 minutes to come back to us with an answer for this, 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 and this. And it was amazing. There are deputy principals, there are principals, there's even university lecturers in that group. And they were absolutely enthralled, engaged by these little 20-minute activities that the kids had actually put together for them. I won't go into the depth and detail of it, but you can see the level of engagement even on their faces. And you can also see that they know where to sit down, they have to walk around, they have to use the whatever available space is there for them. And it all worked out very well. They then challenged them, they challenged the teachers to put their findings together and put them up on the web. And some of them had never built websites, some of them had never used WordPress, some of them had never used Audioboom, so the kids filled in the gaps. They spent some time teaching them, 20 minutes, half an hour, at the end of which they were all able to actually upload to the website that we'd built for the day. And it was intriguing to see the learning taking place. People really enjoyed it, and I suppose that's the point I'm trying to work on. That there's a question there about the type of task. Well, the simplest task in one case was to look through some photographs. This is borrowed from a colleague of mine called Digital Citizen, and to match the photographs with job roles. So who do you think is the engineer? Who do you think is the nurse? But the problem, of course, is that they're photographs of young people. So it was pictures of people when they were younger who went on to be certain things. And there was great discussion about this whole idea and some wonderful learning. I mean, you'd look at a face and say, oh yeah, she's the teacher. In actual fact, she's the one that ended up in jail. Now, no connection, but that's just the way it goes. So that's one example of a task, if that helps. Okay, that's what the room looked like by the time they were finished. That's the level of activity and engagement that was very, very typical of the entire day. So at that stage, once the thing starts, the hardest thing for most of us as teachers to do is to get out of the way. And that's one of the things that the youth media team are wonderful at doing. Once they saw the activities starting to hop, they just stepped back and let it happen. So I think that's testimony to, if we take nothing else away from today, I think it's that you have to be able to kind of, give space, build the space, and then give the room, the physical space as well as the mental space for people to actually learn, and so on. So in summary, I suppose what we're seeing in that particular space is examples of creative activity. We're seeing them making things, we're seeing them answering challenges, we're seeing them being critical in the sense of engaging with challenges and problems and coming up with good solutions. We're seeing them being participatory, and we're seeing them being ethical. They didn't, steal stuff, they didn't put stuff on the web that they hadn't permission to use, and so on. So all of those ideas to do with digital citizenship were actually made possible in and through the learning space that the youth media team had actually built for the students, the master's students in this case, the teachers who come in for the CPD on the day. Hat tip, I suppose, and I'm coming to the last of the few slides now at this stage because I think I'm sort of more or less up against my time. I always go back to Popper. I'm one of those people who believes that Popper, is one of the greatest thinkers in relation to teaching and learning. Popper has said in 1965-66, the process of learning, the process of the growth of subjective knowledge is always the same. It is imaginative criticism. And I think that's what learning spaces are in so many ways all about. It's about allowing space for imaginative criticism. It's about allowing space for people to grow and to develop and to become the kinds of critical commentators that they can and should in many ways be. So in summary, I would say learning spaces are spaces where it's all about the learning and the teaching. The space is a vehicle. The focus is on the learning and the teaching. More so the learning than the teaching. The teaching is invisible, it floats to the back, we keep out of the way once we set up the activities, and that's, in many cases, that's the best we can actually do. It's about spaces where cooperation is possible and it's helpful. It's not just cooperation for its own sake, it's cooperation to get something done. If people pull together, if they work together, it's enjoyable. They work on challenges that are based on tasks, that are activities, that are tied off on time, 15, 20 minutes, whatever it takes. The technology is there, but the technology is always secondary. The technology is always in the background. And then I think mostly the most important thing is play as possible. It has to be enjoyable, it has to be joyful, and those are the sorts of learning spaces that I think young people particularly will really, really benefit from being exposed to. Um, and, you know, as teachers, we can do this. I do agree with what was said earlier. We can do this. We do need the toolkit, but the most important part of the toolkit, in my book, is here and there. Okay? It's the teaching heart. It's what makes you a teacher. It's what brings us into teaching in the first place. And it's the imagination that allows us to conceive of the sorts of spaces that will allow young people, and indeed older people, colleagues, people we're working with in continual professional development settings, to actually grow and benefit. I'm going back to my kind of theatre metaphor to kind of close out. I would say an awful lot of it is about teaching leadership. It's about being the teacher that people need. And I think we have to work at that. That's why opportunities like this one, where we get to meet groups of teachers and talk and listen to each other, hopefully, and pick up ideas, I think are absolutely invaluable. It must be more than the formal arrangements that schools put in place. It must be part of our mission to educate ourselves. A huge amount of it is about learning spaces, these spaces that we build for our kids, for our students, and that they co-build with us. Sometimes they're virtual, sometimes they're real world, sometimes they are literally physical sets where you build something and do something in that space, like the youth media team and their tent and so on. And it's also about critical pedagogy. It's about getting people to be rightly cautious, careful, and critical about the world in which we live. And I think that's part of being a digital citizen. It's also a profoundly important part of being a citizen. And I think that is a challenge that we are going to find ourselves facing more and more over the next couple of years, as Europe becomes a very different sort of space from anything that it has been in the past and anything that it is likely to be, say 60, 70 or 80 years from now. We are at a transition point where citizenship matters in a way that it probably never did before. I think that's more or less everything that I wanted to say. Thank you for bearing with me. And I think, Rutha, at this stage, if you like, we can hand the floor over to questions, comments, and observations. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Conor. Yes, I would like to, first of all, thank you for the very interesting reflection. It's always important to remind teachers that we can do differently and we can improve always. I'm not sure if someone wants to speak. I can give the floor to someone, or if you want to make some comment or question in the chat.
To leave on a positive, I have a very much a positive outlook on life, and we have done a lot of experimenting with our spaces here in Killarglen. And you play with the cards you're dealt. You know, if we start thinking about of all the roadblocks that are there, and about legislators and building units, so on and so forth, we'll get nowhere. I'd encourage teachers, don't be afraid to move out of your space. Bring our teachers here. You walk through the school, you could see a geography class throwing a blow up world map around the canteen. Um, I'm a technical graphics, a drawing teacher myself, and I could never grasp. I spent weeks and weeks trying to get the whole idea of transformation geometry across inside in the classroom with whiteboard markers and PowerPoint. And each year now, I get bits of string and bits of handles of brushes and all sorts of other props, and I move out into the common area, and I actually cover and get the whole concept of transformation geometry across in one double period, whereas before I would be spending 2 weeks on that. But I suppose empower teachers, those of you who are leaders and in management, encourage teachers, and don't get caught up on whatever country you're in. Don't get caught up in the negativity of the downturn in the economy or waiting for that new school to be built. Embrace it, and as I said earlier on, embrace change, play with the small things, and those larger obstacles will start to diminish over time.
One thing that I've noticed recently, and it's not yet European wide, and this is perhaps a challenge to the UN as much as anything else. There is a wonderful movement that has started in Scotland originally, has moved into different parts of the UK, and has landed in Ireland in the last couple of years, called the Teach Meet movement. TEACHMEET. I recommend highly enough, cannot recommend highly enough the actual possibilities of attending a Teach Meet if you get the opportunity to do so. Basically what happens is teachers come along and they talk for 10 minutes or 2 minutes or 15 minutes about stuff that they're doing in relation to their classes. You get the full range of teachers. There's one coming up next week very close to where I live, which is for the Frobel Institute here in Ireland. I'm going along. I'm a secondary teacher originally by training. I'm an English teacher by training, but I'll go along and I'll do my 5 minutes. I'll talk a little bit about using Audio Boom or something like that. And it's a wonderful bazaar, a marketplace to exchange ideas in a way that's not possible in more formal situations and settings. It's not everything, and I do fully accept the fact that there will always be the need to have more formal CPD and so on. But I think these informal opportunities, everything from the kind of high quality learning event that UN is becoming quite famous for, through to the MOOCs that they run, through to the seminars like this, right the way down to what you can do locally with colleagues in your own school and in your own district, I think are profoundly important in terms of teachers making a claim for being professional by working on our own professionalism in our own time, as well as in the more formal settings. And that sounds like a bit of a rant. I'm sorry about that. But my observation would be that when the spaces are right to do that, it makes the learning joyful. And I think that's something that we all need to work a little bit more on, bringing back the fun in terms of learning, so that it doesn't become a drudge, that it doesn't become something you have to do to stay licensed or registered as a teacher, that it is something we do because we love and enjoy the work that we do as teachers. And maybe that's a good point, Rutha, for me to stop for the moment.
Thank you, Conor. I think we have just one more participant that wants to speak, and I will give the floor to Valentina.
It was a privilege to be in this webinar, in this learning seminar. And what I wanted to say is that all it takes is a bit of creativity from the teacher. Because in Macedonia, it's not really a good economy, and we don't have a lot of things, but we do manage with internet, and at least we use our own. But whenever there is some activity of this kind of working, collaborating, changing the space, changing the way of teaching and everything, students are really excited about it, and they learn a lot. I've already mentioned that I've done an ebook with my students, done at the in the class during the lesson, and then we've done some with bring your own device method. We've done stop motion movies, and it's something they will remember for a long time. Yes. It's something that they will enjoy, and something they are showing off with to their to other students in the school, out of the school, and to their friends and relatives and everything. So it's not really hard to change the space of learning, because all it takes is a bit of creativity. It's the same room, but in a different constellation, probably.
Yes,
I should say.
That's an excellent way of describing it, and I would agree absolutely with what you say. I mean, our tent, I think, cost us €15. One of the kids picked it up on one of these buy or sell type pages. So nothing that we actually use to build our spaces cost us very much money. It's all down to the imagination. The one comment I would make to follow from what you said is that I think what you've said there about working with kids is so true. It works brilliantly with children, but it also works with adults. If you get a group of teachers to interact around stop motion photography or to interact around building a blog, the results are equally fantastic. And they learn, and there's joy in it, and they're learning materials, they're picking up ideas they can bring back to their own classrooms as well. And I think that sort of thing is super. It's so important that we continue to do that, because while we are reaching more and more teachers, and while we are getting better at providing opportunities for teachers to upskill, to use that terrible word, it is still very much early days. There's a lot to be done in schools. That is not to place any blame at all on the teachers. I think teachers go well over what could be expected of any other profession. But we do, if we value ourselves as professionals, we do need to invest time, energy, and effort in those activities that involve creativity, that involve engaging with others, that involve, moving our teaching forward in a positive way that makes use of opportunities and technologies, rather than having to, respond negatively or respond because we are being criticized for not using them. I think that's a big problem right across Europe, which kind of brings me back to that European Forum. I think it is so wrong that there are no teacher voices heard in these spaces. And I have actually, in my own small way, I've written, a bit of a rocket. I've sent it to the people that organise that, and you never know. Maybe there will be teachers involved the next edition. That's it.
Thank you, Conor. So if we don't have any more comments, I think we can close this session.
Okay, well, just again, thank you, Ruth, very, very much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to talk to colleagues, and I hope that people have taken one or two ideas away that they can use in their own learning spaces. And I look forward to, my email is there on the screen. I look forward to hearing a little bit about your adventures in learning spaces over the next while. And do please build them into eTwinning projects as well. Very important. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you, Conor, once more. And to finalize and to close, I would like to inform you about the next online seminar. It will be on Enable, which is a project that focuses on combating bullying, empowering young people. It will be, again, one very interesting seminar. It will be on the 12th of May, and I hope to see you there. Again, this session is recorded. We will share very soon the recording in the eTwinning portal, and you will receive a certificate as well for participating in this session. So once more, thank you so much for being here, and hope to see you soon in an eTwinning event.